The negatives of cannabis? Sure, I would be glad to. I'm Lex Pelger. I do canna education for CV Sciences and makers of Plus CBD, fine CBD and THC products. I'm also somewhat of a professional devil's advocate. And so when old ladies ask me about CBD and THC, I'm like, oh, it could be helpful. And when stoners ask about the negatives, I have a lot to share. So here's the top 6 things I would say are negatives from cannabis. And I'm not going to do the thing with all the fancy proofs in the back. This stuff is so overwhelmingly true that if you just read the last 2 or 3 of my newsletters, Cannabinoids and the People, you'll see this data repeated every single week. If you really want the studies, DM me about it. But there is a lot of evidence for things like, number 1, cardio effects. This is public health level data, but it's quite clear that if you're someone who's smoking pot or ingesting cannabis, you have slightly higher risks for things like heart attacks and just other cardio problems. It makes some sense. You have a lot of cannabinoid receptors in your cardiac tissue. They tend to be activated when you have heart problems, but they are there. They're just not there at high levels when you're healthy. And that same thing, you see case studies of young kids coming in, and it seems like it really was the cannabis that caused them to have some kind of cardiac event when high schoolers or 20-year-olds. And people are always like, oh, well, I'm sure it wasn't the weed. Well, when you look at the public health data, sometimes it is the weed. Speaking of public health data, respiratory problems from the smoking itself. I've talked about that before. It's pretty obvious. Your lung cancer rates do not go up with cannabis. Actually, they might even go down a little bit, according to Dr. Tashkin of UCLA. But you certainly have a higher risk of respiratory infections in general. It's not a lot higher, but you can imagine burning plant material is going to make that happen. Mental health. Yes, schizophrenia and PTSD. Certain cannabinoids in certain usages, especially used in moderation, can be helpful for those conditions, for sure. But absolutely they can worsen those conditions, especially PTSD and schizophrenia, where they can cause you to be disconnected from life. Cannabis is amazing for disconnecting you from life. Sometimes it's a good thing, and it can be a bad thing. Speaking of addiction, cannabis is obviously addictive. Physically, it is moderately addictive. You have some of those little withdrawal symptoms for a few days after you stop. For some people, maybe even 2 weeks. But it can be mentally addictive like any other behavioral thing. And so I certainly struggle with addiction to cannabis in my life. Reproduction. It is definitely not helpful for reproduction. If you're trying to get pregnant, it is not good for either the female or the male in that situation. It's not a giant drag. Lots of people get pregnant while using cannabis. But that's one thing. And then finally, impaired driving. So there's some harms.